Welcome back to the panel discussion, Moving to the Cloud, What's the Best Approach for Me, sponsored by NetApp and BlueRiver IT, here on Federal News Radio 1500 AM and federalnewsradio.com. Our guests today are Sandra Kuntz, Director of Production Operations and Infrastructure in the Office of the CIO at the Peace Corps, Mary Jean Schmidt, Federal Business Development Manager at NetApp, David McLaughlin, CEO and owner of BlueRiver IT, and Harry Lee, Senior Computer Scientist for Infrastructure at the Census Bureau. And earlier we talked about data. Let's talk about the purpose of data, which is really applications. And if you would give us an overview, Sandra, of what the Peace Corps' application strategy is for the cloud. What apps or applications, you got to be careful because it's not quite the same word anymore, you have moved to the cloud, what you plan to do, and what you're looking at over the next couple of years.
Okay. At Peace Corps, of course, our business is volunteers, supporting volunteers.
And they all have smartphones now.
And they all have smartphones, and they all have preferred ways of getting to their data. But our challenge is making sure that volunteers in remote locations, as well as the Peace Corps staff overseas in our 70 somewhat remote locations, and headquarters staff can all have access to that same data. In some cases, it's also the public that needs to have access to that data. So our first couple of applications that we moved to the cloud were around the volunteer onboarding process. Which is actually a very lengthy and complex process. It would not seem like it should be, but lots of information is gathered about potential volunteers and as they move through the process.
I mean, it's almost like security level clearance to some degree.
It is, and looking at all sorts of issues, education, health, travel needs, etc. So looking at a number of applications around that application process and onboarding is what was initially taken to the cloud a few years ago. And that has worked out well. We've learned a lot of lessons around how best to support applications and data in the cloud. We've learned about contracting and service level agreements that need to be in place to manage those services. Apart from that, we have also put our public website out into the cloud several years ago, and that was also a successful endeavor. It's worked well for us, learned a lot of lessons, and going forward, we are looking at cloud first, so what applications that come along really could be put in the cloud most easily. Our challenges, again, are for things that have to be globally accessed. From our remote locations, just making sure that the cloud solution works well in those cases. Going forward, we are focusing on storage and moving as much of our internal data that makes sense out to the cloud. And I had mentioned earlier our communications repository, which is really very vast, moving that out to a storage location in the cloud. We've also been looking at tools and management tools and looking at where cloud solutions in those areas are appropriate. And we've chosen... When you say management tools, you mean software management tools? Software, network, things, for example, that manage, I mentioned bandwidth challenges and most efficiently using our bandwidth. There are cloud-based tools around that, so, filtering traffic that comes and goes and making sure we're effectively using our bandwidth. That we've done in the cloud. We also at Peace Corps, as you mentioned, our volunteers are very mobile-based, mobility-oriented, and so we're looking at MDM, mobile device management solutions that are cloud-based as well. For applications going forward, we have a very effective process of involving business owners, our security staff, financial and contracts people really early on in the start of a new project that might end in an application. So we're trying to get the right people oriented at the beginning to choose the best solution.
And briefly about that volunteer onboarding process that is in the cloud. Is that a web interface? And is the application and the data all together in the same cloud?
Yes. Yes, it is.
And is that virtualized?
Yes, it is virtualized. It's a solution that was actually developed initially for the cloud by a provider that we're using. Yes.
But you haven't done the email piece yet.
We have not done the email piece, and our challenge there has been, again, just making the best decision for our overseas the majority of Peace Corps staff actually work overseas. And again, I can't stress enough the difficulties we have connecting with them. So we want to make sure right now they're very self-contained. If they should lose their connection to the internet, they need to be able to continue functioning because there's people there who have to continue work. So that's a big factor for us.
So that means data at rest on the device sometimes.
Data at rest on the device, and we have all our security concerns around that as well. So.
And David, before we move to Harry on what the census is doing application-wise, I just wanted to ask you, while we're on that thought, what do you find that customers do that do have tenuous connections, and yet the data center is solid, but it's the connection between device, either PC too or a mobile device, and back where the applications and data sit?
We've seen quite a bit of that over the years, and it started initially when you saw the data center consolidation. So people taking a lot of data from what was the edge and putting it in the center now. So there are tools that you can use to actually optimize the connections. There are tools that you can use to keep data close, but still somewhat keep it in the center. So you have to look at each individual environment and determine what's best. So if you're in 70 locations around the world and your provider is doing, very, very low bandwidth, supporting low bandwidth, and the cost is really high, you may have to keep your data close to them. It really just depends on what people need. So when we build something out and design it, it's based on what works best, but what's also the most flexible. So you really have to take a look at it closely.
So you might have some data cached locally that is frequently invoked, and that saves bandwidth and so on.
Or how do you get the data back for archive purposes or disaster recovery, or is this data that you can keep at the edge, in a location that maybe isn't as quite secure? So there are tools that you can use to push data around, both from the mechanism to make it go as well as to speed it up.
Okay, and Harry, tell us about census and applications. What have you moved? I think you have done email. Correct me if I'm wrong, but what else, especially in the mission-critical area?
I'll talk about what we have moved and what we're looking at. How's that?
Fair enough.
So a couple things. One, we do use a cloud-provided service for web content delivery and for some security controls to prevent some denial of service attacks based on a lot of increased usage by the public. We are moving to web-based email. We're doing that this fiscal year. Hope to be done by the end of the fiscal year. We do use a cloud-based service for mobile device management to manage all of our mobile devices. And I think Sandy said you're going there, so maybe we can share some experiences with you. Virtual meetings. Customer relationship and experience management. We are doing customer satisfaction surveys using a web-based tool, some social media measurement and monitoring, and for the previous decennial, we used a cloud-based service for some personnel recruitment and hiring processes. Going forward, I mentioned earlier that we're looking at our survey life cycle around the collection, the processing, the analysis, and dissemination of data. And we're looking at the business processes and all the applications that support each of those components of our survey lifecycle to identify where cloud-based solutions might benefit us the best. So a couple of things we're looking at, no plans, we're just looking at right now. I mentioned internet data collection. We're using that for all of our surveys and censuses now. High-performance computing capabilities, data analytics, help desk resources, development and test environments where we might need some on-demand services specifically around testing, high performance testing and things like that might best use in the cloud. Managing supporting field staff. The field staff supports all the surveys and all the censuses. We're looking at cloud-based solutions for that as well. So while we're looking at those applications and business solutions that could use a cloud, our focus internally has been this private cloud to kind of really optimize our current environment and to build that framework, service delivery framework, so when we bring these applications on via cloud-based, they'll just fit into this existing framework.
All right, so it sounds like a lot of homework, especially with high performance computing and analytics. I see those as paired in some way.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, and MDM, we heard about mobile device management, and Mary Jean, that's an area of software nobody ever heard of 5 years ago. Now it's burgeoning, but it's really more than just counting BlackBerries and iPhones. It's a matter of, in fact, all devices, all endpoints are coming into MDMs, and application repositories and download sites are part of it. They're really spreading, and so people have a choice of cloud versus locally hosted or internally hosted. What are you seeing as the trend there, just using that as an example of the type of new style application that may originate with cloud?
Right. Well, I think it's kind of like the confluence, really, of, how a user wants to access or needs to access an application and where the application and or data, associated with it reside, right? So just as Harry and Sandra said, we're seeing a lot of agencies have gone to MDM as a service, basically. And in fact, NetApp as a company, we use a cloud, if you will, for mobile device management for our company. So that's something I think you're seeing across the board. But then it kind of brings back that same question we talked about a little earlier about the data and the application workload. So some applications will be, easily and readily put in a cloud environment, so a mobile device can access them, whether it's over a bandwidth that's very limited or something that's more robust, and some might not lend themselves to that environment. Harry mentioned some of the the high performance computing analytics. Those might not be the best things to be running on your mobile device, but by and large, agencies still have to provide those capabilities. So they might want to look to put the data and the compute closer together, whether they use it in-house or whether they use a combination of kind of a private, if you will, data store and a public kind of hyperscaler compute farm or some variation. So all those are possible today. That's what's so interesting about the environment.
And so when thinking about cloud applications, do you have to look at the applications themselves, not just the criticality, but the nature of them? Some of them are bursty, some of them are steady streaming, some of them can take some latency, some of them can't. I mean, there's a lot of considerations. Is there like a decision tree in some manner that people follow as a methodology to do that? Yeah,
I mean, absolutely. It's absolutely about the workload and the requirements of it. I probably can't speak to the decisions that the agencies have to make. I think it's a heavy lifting task, right, to understand where you put the workload and what performance requirements it has and balance that with the sensitivity of the data you have to access, and then on top of it, the access management or the way that your end users are going to access it, whether it's the repository Sandra spoke of that needs this global reach, on maybe the smallest device, or whether it's something one of the census, data scientists needs to do to develop more information. So it's really a tough road, I think, for agencies. It's not an easy task.
Yeah, and of course we've been talking a lot about mobility, but desktop PCs still exist, notebooks, I mean, those are still, maybe they don't sell as many as they did, but they're very much part of the computing landscape. So the cloud has to feed the Ethernet in the building at some point also. David, how does that figure, and what do people look at in that environment?
Well, again, it's not always the case where you can just throw more bandwidth at it. A lot of it comes down to the applications that you're deploying and how they're accessed. We've seen customers, for example, that are in the Midwest that feel like they can put a big connection between there and a data center in Virginia, and that will be sufficient for them to run storage locally and compute in the cloud and together, when that's not really the case. So bandwidth is a big concern. And one of the things back to applications is, there are some applications that people will feel, they're web-enabled, they're very easy to move to a cloud environment. I think that people don't always see that there are applications that will remain in-house and how those are accessed in a public or commercially available cloud environment. How do those connections take place? So if you're in a data center in Europe, let's say, or you have a location in Europe and your cloud provider's in Virginia, Ashburn, Virginia, how does that happen? There's content distributed networks that work. There's all sorts of different ways to address it. But again, it comes down to a lot of what the end user requirements are and what's available.
Okay. Yes, and that gets to census. Harry, you mentioned earlier management. Also, you have an infrastructure now that is hybrid, that there's census data centers and there's public clouds and private clouds, maybe even other government clouds, maybe commerce there. So what's your approach to managing all of that infrastructure? Some you own, some you rent, it's the government, but it's not yours.
Well, we have, I guess I'll use the word governance around managing the infrastructure. We have three things that help us kind of guide the decision-making around infrastructure and how we best manage it. One is something called enterprise architecture, right? So it's where do we need to go to support the strategic plan and the mission of census. And that identifies, from a technical perspective, we looked at 5 kind of platforms that we need to manage over time, infrastructure platforms. Cloud is one of those. So what do we need to do from today going forward from a target state? And we manage this thing called infrastructure roadmap. So in addition to cloud, there's a platform for mobility. There's a platform for communication and collaboration. There's a platform for security, for data management, and for service management. So we use that roadmap to guide where we need to go. We also have an infrastructure or IT investment review board that approves all of the investments going forward, and the CEO has approval authority of all those investments. But in support of that, we have an engineering process. So we talked about cloud first, we talked about virtualized first, shared first. So when a team puts together a detailed set of requirements and looks at the design alternatives, we look at those options. And so we have to check the box. Did we look at a cloud? Does it satisfy our requirements or not? Did we look at shared services? Did we look at virtualization first? So we use the roadmap and the governance process to help make good, smart decisions about where we use cloud.
All right, we're going to take a short break on that note. Our guests today are Sandra Kuntz, Director of Production Operations and Infrastructure in the Office of the CIO at the Peace Corps, Harry Lee, Senior Computer Scientist for Infrastructure at the Census Bureau, Mary Jean Schmidt, Federal Business Development Manager at NetApp, and David McLaughlin, CEO and owner of BlueRiver IT. I'm your moderator, Tom Temin. You're listening to Moving to the Cloud, What's the Best Approach for Me? A panel discussion sponsored by NetApp and BlueRiver IT, here on Federal News Radio 1500 AM and federalnewsradio.com.